Post-war prosperity had kept conservatives at bay. Then, in the 1970s, economic growth ground to a halt and Americans faced an unfamiliar combination of inflation and rising employment. Economists termed this novel condition stagflation. After emerging from World War II as the most prosperous nation in the world and retaining this status through the 1960s, the country suddenly found itself falling behind Western Europe and Japan. Meanwhile, Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter promised little and, as far as many voters were concerned, delivered less. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973 made Americans painfully aware of their dependence on Middle East oil supplies. Although Nixon responded by appointing an energy czar and promoting conservation, energy prices climbed, raising rents and food bills with them. At the same time, the United States lost ground to Asian and European producers of cheaper and more efficient cars, televisions, radios, tape players, cameras, and computers. The United States had lost its dominance in the global economy. An AFL-CIO leader complained that the United States was becoming a nation of hamburger stands and a country stripped of industrial capacity and meaningful work. Industrial unions shrank, although growth in service industries made up for some of these losses. The slump also hurt working women. Between 1955 and 1980, the wage gap worsened, with women falling from 64% of men's earnings to 59%. And women clustered in occupations where the lowest wages prevailed. African American women made some gains. By 1980, Northern black women's median earnings were about 95% of white women's earnings. Hispanic women flooded into the workforce, but mainly in low-wage jobs with few prospects of advancements. The environmental downside of the post-World War II economic boom was becoming painfully evident. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1973, and pollution and climate change became political issues. Activists succeeded in blocking some massive construction projects, such as nuclear energy plants. More often, they halted small-scale destruction of a natural habitat or an historic urban district. At Love Canal, near Buffalo, toxic wastes dumped by the Hooker Chemical Laboratory had oozed into basements and backyards, and in 1978, homemaker Lois Gibbs organized her neighbors to draw attention to the grim situation. Eventually, New York State bought up all the houses and relocated families. Congress responded to pressure by creating the EPA in 1970 and passed scores of bills to protect endangered species, reduce automobile pollution, limit and ban the use of some pesticides, and control strip mining practices. City leaders, both Democratic and Republican, resisted congressional mandates for reduction in air pollution, stalling compliance. George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO, denounced tree-hugger environmentalists as enemies of economic growth, and the United Auto Workers lobbyists joined automakers in resisting emission and gas mileage rules. Environmentalists lost a key campaign with the approval of the Alaska Pipeline, 800 miles of pipe, often leaking into an endangered environment, connecting oil fields with refining facilities in the lower 48, an issue that we are still dealing with today. Ford and Carter presided over a depressed economy and a nation of disillusioned citizens, increasingly open to conservative appeals. The pardon of Richard Nixon reinforced public cynicism and toward government and Ford in particular. Ford's nomination of Nelson Rockefeller annoyed conservatives, and his WIN program was ridiculed. First Lady Betty Ford broke ranks with conservatives to champion gun control, the Equal Rights Amendment, and abortion rights. Ford banked on his incumbency for the 1976 election, and dumping Rockefeller picked Kansas Senator Robert Dole as his running mate, and narrowly won renomination. After a fight with Teddy Kennedy, Jimmy Carter, a former Navy officer and the governor of Georgia, as well as a born-again Christian, who presented himself as a political outsider, won the Democratic nod. Counting on support from both conservative and Southern voters who would ordinarily vote Republican, he defended existing entitlement programs while opposing Kennedy's call for comprehensive health coverage. Capitalizing on Ford's unpopular Nixon pardon, Carter got just over 50% of the popular vote and a 297 to 240 margin in the Electoral College. In office, Carter seemed to many observers enigmatic and even uninterested in the presidency, more conservative than liberal. Although he carried out reforms of airline regulation and improved efficiency of some programs, his lack of a clear energy policy was ridiculed and stagflation raged on. His defeat in 1980 left liberalism and the Democratic Party discredited and in disarray. In April 1975, the North Vietnamese captured Saigon as the South Vietnamese army, now without U.S. assistance, fell apart. All fighting stopped within a few weeks, and Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam was reunited under a communist government. The limits of American global power were clear for all to see. Announcing a new morality in foreign policy, Carter reversed decades of support for repressive right-wing regimes in Latin America and sought to rein in the CIA. In the Middle East, Carter brought together Israeli leader Misham Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat at Camp David in 1978 and mediated a peace treaty signed in Washington in 1979. Despite the accord, the status of Palestinians remained unresolved. Carter's foreign policy morality led to a controversial agreement to return the Panama Canal to Panamanian control, with a treaty narrowly ratified by Senate in 1978. In 1979, the U.S. finally granted diplomatic recognition to Communist China, but Carter angered conservatives by severing ties with nationalist Taiwan. Human rights and national interest collided as Carter continued to support repressive regimes in South Korea, El Salvador, and the Philippines, and he refused to recognize the leftist Sandinista in Nicaragua despite pleas for humanitarian aid. Détente continued with the signing of the SALT II Treaty in 1979, but a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the same year reversed the trend, and Carter sent covert military aid to Afghan fighters while cutting off grain shipments to Russia and blocking American participation in the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Iran hostage crisis made President Carter's previous problems seem small by comparison. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East had long depended on a friendly government in Iran. After the CIA helped restore the Shah in 1953, millions of dollars of U.S. military and economic aid had poured in to prop up the Shah, who was very unpopular with his people. In a state visit, Carter toasted the Shah for his great leadership and overlooked rampant corruption in government and well-organized opposition. In 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic revolutionaries overthrew the Shah. When Carter let the Shah come to the United States for medical treatment, some of the Khomeini's hostages retaliated, storming the U.S. Embassy and taking the American staff as hostages. After more than a year of indecision and as oil prices stalled, Carter ordered U.S. military forces to stage a disastrous nighttime helicopter rescue mission. The political and economic fallout destroyed what was left of Carter's credibility, as his energy policy and human rights-based foreign policy lay in ruin. Economic and foreign policy failures mobilized the politics of resentment. Many whites resented higher taxes to fund programs for minorities and the poor, while slowing economic development and doing nothing for the middle class and poor whites. In 1978, a California taxpayers' revolt led to Proposition 13 that cut property taxes and government revenues for social programs and education. Old-style conservatives lined up behind these initiatives, as did the New Right. By far the largest component, evangelical or born-again Protestants took shape as larger and more powerful political force. Neocons, or neoconservatives, many of them former liberal Democrats who had lost faith in the New Deal and Great Society, sought to repeal Johnson's affirmative action programs and dismantle the anti-poverty programs, believing that equality of opportunity had been replaced by an unfair quest for equality of outcomes. The heart of neoconservatism, however, was foreign policy. Angered over failure in Vietnam, neoconservatives called for a stronger national defense against communism. They opposed détente and accused Carter of allowing communists to advance in third world countries and responding to Soviet occupation of Afghanistan too timidly. Neoconservatives played an important role in building the institutional foundation for a right-wing turn in American politics. Well-funded think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Foundation, and the Scaife Foundations offered opportunities to individuals and institutions agreeable to their views. The surge rightward gained intellectual respectability from neoconservatives and prepared the way for broad popular support. During the 1970s, evangelical Protestants, who grew to more than 50 million Americans, became the backbone of the new right as fundraisers and recruiters for conservative PACs and community-based organizations. Members of the religious right generally supported neoconservatives on foreign and domestic policy, including a balanced budget amendment, returning prayer to public schools, and the Supreme Court reinstatement of the death penalty in 1977. As grassroots activists, they provided the political muscle that carried Orange County conservatism from the margins to the center of the Republican Party. TV ministers such as Pat Robertson, Jimmy Swaggart, and Jim and Tammy Faye Baker reinforced this message. Jerry Falwell's Old-Time Gospel Hour was broadcast over 200 television stations and 300 radio stations each week. And in 1979, Falwell formed the Moral Majority that quickly claimed a membership of 2 to 3 million and lobbied for tough laws against homosexuality and pornography, cuts in welfare spending, and an increase in defense spending. The Moral Majority also waged well-publicized campaigns against school integration and busing. The defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, stood at the top of the new right agenda. Under the Equal Rights Amendment, it says in Section 1, equality of rights under law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. In Section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Section 3 states, this amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification. Nearly all mainstream women's organizations and both political parties endorsed the ERA after it was approved in Congress in 1972. In response, the new right swung into action. Stop ERA and the Eagle Forum, both founded by Phyllis Schlafly, mounted large expensive campaigns in each swing state and overwhelmed the pro-ERA resources. Phyllis Schlafly is very well known for starting all her speeches by thanking her husband for allowing her to be able to talk at these rallies. Although 35 states had ratified the ERA by 1979, the amendment remained 3 votes short of passage and died in 1982. The pro-family movement also attacked Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court ruling restricting state bans on abortion on grounds of women's privacy rights. Opponents of Roe rallied for a constitutional amendment defining conception as the beginning of life and arguing the rights of the unborn supersede a woman's right to control her own body. By 1980, the National Right to Life Committee had 11 million members. Groups such as the Orange County Pro-Life Political Action Committee rallied against sex education programs in public schools. Activists also picketed Planned Parenthood counseling centers, intimidating potential clients, and extremists bombed dozens of abortion clinics. Carter's prospects for re-election appeared to rest on the hopes of an improved economy and resolution of the Iran hostage crisis. Democrats unenthusiastically endorsed Carter along with his running mate Walter Mondale. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan had been building his Republican campaign since his near nomination in 1976. Former CIA Director and Texas oil executive George H.W. Bush, more moderate than Reagan, became the Republican candidate for vice president. While Carter implored Americans to tighten their belts, Reagan assured them that America's best days lay ahead and promised to cut taxes. Reagan's platform embraced the conservative agenda, calling for less government and a return to family values. Reagan's victory marked a resounding defeat for liberalism. Carter won only 41.2% of the popular vote to Reagan's 50.9%, 49 votes in the Electoral College to Reagan's 489. Orange County gave Reagan a whopping 68% of the vote. White working people, the traditional supporters of the Democratic Party had defected to the Republicans in large numbers, although both women and African Americans voted for Reagan in far fewer numbers. And barely half of the eligible voters had turned out, bringing Reagan into office with a slim mandate of 25%. In a final cruel twist, the Iranians released the hostages on Inauguration Day, humiliating Carter and boosting Reagan's popularity.